welcome to episode 3 of PlannerPod, the podcast of the Planner magazine, the official member magazine of the Royal Town Planning Institute. I'm Ben Gosling, senior writer on the Planner, and I'm joined by my co-host, Simon Wicks.
Hello.
Editor of the Planner, and special guest host, eminent planning lawyer and planner columnist, Nicola Gooch, who has recently started a new role at Burkitt's LLP.
Hi.
Welcome to you both. And we're joined today by Rob Shaw as our guest, who's Managing Director at Third Revolution Project. Over 25 years' experience in the sector. We're looking forward to chatting with Rob a little later about all things energy.
Hello.
Hello, Rob. Before that, though, our planner picks. So, Nicola, what's something that's caught your eye in the latest issue of the Planner?
Assuming that we're taking the rule that I can't pick my own column.
It was a good one. Always is. Yeah.
I've gone with, in the risk of hoping to be invited back, the amazing piece that Simon wrote on spatial development strategies and how it ties in with local government reform, which I think is probably one of the big long-term things that we're all going to have to grapple with. How the reintroduction of strategic planning, which I think we can all agree is a good thing, and the reorganisation of local government are going to fit together and move forward into the hopefully bright and sunny future for all of us.
I thought that it was very much a snapshot that I know nothing about this. I quite happily hold my hands up and say, I know absolutely nothing. So I came in completely green. But we just had a feeling from things we were picking up in the field that there was a certain amount of anxiety, a lack of clarity about how strategic plans and local plans in particular were going to fit together. So I was trying to answer that question, but it's an ever-shifting landscape. You know, we're in the middle of things. It's going to change very quickly.
And Simon, what's your planner pick from the latest issue?
Well, for me, the big issue really that's sort of sitting behind everything at the moment, and which I think is animating a lot of strong feeling within the planning world and within the RTPI in particular, is the government's decision to withdraw funding from people over 21 who are on the level 7 degree apprenticeship. Now, while I'm sure there's a perfectly good rationale, they want to get more younger people into apprenticeships and sort of more people at that sort of first degree level. The L7 largely is sort of aimed at people at a postgraduate degree level. The issue for planning is that around 87% or so, something like that, of the planners who are on the L7 planning degree apprenticeship will no longer qualify. And around 70% of them go into the public sector. And that's around 200 people a year. In just 4 or 5 years, we've gone from nothing to 200 L7 to postgraduate degree apprentices coming through the planning schools. It's been a wonderful fillip for the planning schools. It's great for the industry. It's fantastic for the sector. And we know we have this resources crisis. We know we have this recruitment crisis. The government has promised 300 new planners a year, but they're just taking away 200. Like that.
Absolutely. And, you know, you're right, it does seem completely sort of incongruous with the government's plans. You know, we had Paul Morrison, who's Chief Executive of the Planning Inspectorate, who came and spoke to us about, you know, their goals and how they're doing a huge recruitment drive at the moment. And it just, you know, the government's decision seems completely out of step with some of their ambitions.
It's completely counterproductive, and it's counterintuitive that you would want to, you know, you would put so much pressure onto planning to deliver public policy at a time when we're talking about growth and infrastructure expenditure and reshuffling of government systems and all the rest of it, all of which are dependent to some degree on planning and a planning system that works well. A planning system that works well needs good planners coming through at a good pace, a good number of them, particularly within the public sector. And here we are taking away a major source of new young planners, and that's a real problem. And the RTPI, I think, has responded to that by effectively writing what's effectively an open letter to the minister saying that please rethink this, or at least give us a stay of execution while we come up with an alternative. But in the meantime, you know, it's not looking good.
So my pick, which we'll just chat quickly about, was the gambling feature, which was written by our consultant editor, Hugh Morris. So as you may have noticed, there's a real sort of proliferation of gambling premises on Britain's high streets, and they are disproportionately concentrated in more deprived areas. And so this contributes a lot to sort of health and social issues, and is costing England 1.7 billion a year from gambling harms. And there's some local authorities who are sort of fighting back to curb these gambling shops, they say that current legislation is out of date, and they're asking for changes to the MPPF to categorise bingo halls and adult gaming centres in the same category as bookmakers. And there's also a parliamentary committee who's asking ministers to consider making directors of public health a responsible authority on planning and licensing applications for gaming establishments. So that's a really interesting article.
It's also the inspiration for one of the best planner covers I think we have had.
Yes.
Since the redesign.
You can't see it, but the cover is basically a slot machine. Very bright, very gaudy, fantastic. Our designer, Craig, said it's the first time he's ever given the designer who made it, an instruction to create something as gaudy as possible. And he certainly came up with the goods. It's brilliant. Really pleased with that. And of course, Rob, you also mentioned the fact that you were going to pick something as well, weren't you, from this issue?
Yeah, we're taking this from the big and important that you guys have highlighted to the niche in planning, and it's the legal insight back on page 54 with Sarah Fitzpatrick talking about a judicial review into overplanting in solar farms. And for the uninitiated, this means the difference between the export capacity of a solar farm, which to avoid being an NSIP project has to be below 50 megawatts, and the capacity if you tot up all the power of the solar panels, which is inevitably more, often by significant percentages. And this is really just clarifying a second judicial review that overplanting, A, is acceptable, and B, can be about more than making up for the degradation of panels over time. It can be for other reasons, like making good use of a scarce grid resource.
So, Rob, you've teed us up quite nicely there to talk about our sort of main topic of the day, really, which, why is energy such a big issue at the moment? Why are we talking about the grid?
So we've probably been talking about the grid for a long time, but it's really come to the fore now for a number of reasons. One is we are rapidly approaching 2030, which is where the government has said our electricity grid needs to be almost entirely decarbonised as a stopping off point towards full net zero in a few decades' time at 2050. But it is also, I think, worth sort of stepping back and looking at just the context here, which is the set of renewable technologies, solar, batteries, onshore wind, and so on, are one part of a series of general purpose technologies. So these are technologies that are pervasive and have transformational impacts on society and economies as a whole, others being artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and material science and so on. They are utterly transformational, and these have been getting cheaper and cheaper and more deployed globally, exponentially. And exponential is a difficult concept for planning to deal with. It's difficult enough for our brains, but for planning, it's difficult because it's totally at odds with the way we plan. So these have gone from being niche and small to suddenly exploding on the scene, and are, like any transformational set of technologies, they reshape the way we use land, the way we create places, and they create conflicts between communities, between developers, between planners. So they are there partly because of the drivers from targets, but also just because these technologies are now so important to our economies and our society that you can't avoid them.
So obviously we've got this sort of huge exponential, as you put it, change going on. What sort of pressure is that putting on the system, and how is that changing? What's the current picture, and what's the pressure that's being put on the system now by the greater availability of these technologies? What is it we need to do to integrate that into the current system?
So when we're talking about the system, I think we need to move beyond just talking about planning. Planning is obviously really important, but it's putting huge pressure on the grid system. Our grid was designed for a very different set of technologies. And society, the industry, the sectors are having to redesign the grid while we're still using it. You're rebuilding your boat while you're still in it and rowing. So that's putting huge pressure on the grid system. That's now operated by a public company since the new government called NESO, National Energy System Operator, which has replaced the National Grid as system operator. It's putting huge pressure on planning and planners because planning is having to, for the most part, deal with applications in a speculative manner rather than in a sort of plan making perspective, which really comes back to Nicola's piece earlier.
I was about to say that strategic planning is part of it, and we do need to marry this up because in some ways the location of these projects are actually being driven by the grid. Because of the issues with capacity and connection, you will find that solar and wind, etc., are the primary driver of a location is where can you connect.
So essentially what we're saying there is, if we were starting from scratch, we'd probably pick X, Y, Z places to put our solar farms and our wind turbine farms and all the rest of it. But because we're not starting from scratch, we may find ourselves putting them in places that are not so suitable locations, but which have quick access to the grid.
Yes, I guess that's right. So certainly in the short term, developers will scour the country for locations where there is capacity to connect a project on the grid, and they will then assess whether it's a non-starter or it's in a national park or what have you, or whether it's appropriate. Whether that is suitable in the given location is down to planning, but it creates conflicts that might be avoided were you to take the grid constraint out of it and put it wherever you wanted. Longer term, and this is where NESO comes back into the equation, there are plans afoot to spatially plan where grid infrastructure and different types of technology are going to be located. That's beyond 2030. Pre-2030, it's more about how does NESO free up capacity in the grid, and there's a lot of things happening on that right now.
So we've got this key date of 2030, and I'm just looking at an appeal here, which we covered in the planner, where the inspector identified a significant undersupply in solar to meet that 2030 target. And, considerable growth in large-scale solar farms are necessary, more than 100 megawatts a week. How are we looking for that target?
So I would expect the inspector has taken that statement from the recent Committee on Climate Change report to Parliament, where they were very clear that solar is falling well short of where it needs to be. Whether they said 100 megawatts a week, I don't know. Whether that was extrapolated from where we are now to where we want to be. But absolutely we collectively as a nation are falling behind where we need to be by that date.
And so how do we start to accelerate? Because, that target is very much looming.
In a simple sense, it'd be great to consent more solar more quickly without it going to appeal and judicial review. But, that's neglects what the planning system is there to do and how it operates. I think ultimately there is no lack of appetite from the industry to develop as much solar, wind, batteries, etc. as they possibly can. There's a great appetite for that. But I think that the mission critical right now next step is firstly outside of planning, and that is this grid reform process that began really back in December and will complete its first round in the autumn, which is effectively asking all developers to reapply for their grid connections. Moving from the system previously where you apply for grid, you get your grid, and you sit on that, irrespective of whether you've got planning, irrespective of whether you've got a land agreement, option ownership, what have you. And there is a whole host of zombie projects, as we might call them, which are ones that are clogging up the system. I mean, hundreds of gigawatts that will never, ever get built. NESO are saying, right, we've got to stop, pause, step back to go forward to get to 2030. And we're now saying, reapply. In order to apply into what's called Gate 2, you have to have proof of ownership or an option agreement to lease the land. And ideally, you need to have submitted for planning, even better, come out of planning, and that will project you up in the queue. And the idea is, so every developers have been applying into Grid 2 right now. That will be assessed over the summer by NESO, and by the autumn, hopefully then they will say, right, here's your grid connections. And most of those will be ones that they consider to be deliverable, i.e. they've got, they're at least into planning, and they've got land. Therefore, it's sensible to give them grid because they're the three main components. Hopefully, when they tot all that up, there will be enough to get to 2030. But without it, we won't have a chance.
I mean, we've mentioned grid reform, so that's one step towards the 2030 goal. What else is there? What else is required, or what else is likely to happen that is going to take us on that journey?
So, the planning system is not going to fundamentally change over for the next few years. The MPPF that came out at the end of last year gave a weighting steer to decision makers that significant weight should be given to the benefits of renewables of a project, which I would say most inspectors were probably doing that. Nicola may say otherwise, but it's clarifying something that was probably there, but it is helpful. Gives a sense to decision makers that if they're minded to refuse a scheme, it's going to stand a good chance at appeal. Many of the barristers we talk to at the moment will say it's a good time to be consenting renewables because that emphasis is on that. But ultimately, we as an industry, as planners and decision makers need to be recognising why we're doing this stuff. It's not just to impose something on unwilling communities, but it's something we need to work together towards this collective critical importance of net zero electricity initially and ultimately net zero carbon.
I think it's quite interesting in that context to look at, bear in mind that this is, particularly when it comes to the larger scale projects, the NSIP programme and those changes, that the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is aimed at streamlining some of that to make that process quicker and faster. And I saw something in the press earlier this week that there might be a further planning bill coming down the line aiming at streamlining that even further, possibly looking at some of the banner reforms about cutting back on judicial review and statutory challenges for these infrastructure projects. So speeding up the consenting process is something which the government is looking at on a statutory basis, but that will take time because getting legislation through always does. What I find quite interesting is, and again this comes down to grid, but it's mostly transmission, the difficulty in getting electricity around the country, because there are places, for example Scotland, where they are generating large amounts of electricity and wind, which can't get very far, and I think is being paid not to generate at peak times at the moment because they just can't cope with the sheer volume of electricity being generated. Is that primarily a lack of storage issue?
So overcapacity at certain times of day is a feature of a renewable-led grid. It's not a bug, it's a feature that needs to be planned. It comes back to one of my first points, which is we're trying to rebuild a grid system for a different type of infrastructure. You don't used to just turn on large gas peakers at peak times, and coal and nuclear will carry on all the time. Now it's vastly more complicated. It's all very doable. But I think that point that you raise, it leads really nicely, I would say, into actually what is the longer term picture here? How does spatial planning, strategic planning play a role in this? Because ultimately, if we've got Scotland, quite rightly, and there are other parts of the country that have oversupply for what they locally need and are constrained by the transmission networks that go north-south to get it down to where it's needed, say down in London, hence why it gets turned off. And that is a waste. So why not find ways to use that energy locally? You talk to some of the big data center, the hyperscale data center providers, and they're saying exactly this. We're going to locate up in the central belt of Scotland because there's plentiful renewables there. It's great for us because we can hopefully contract to buy it cheaply, but it's great for the country because we're not having to pay these guys to turn off when they're not needed. So if we start to think about that more broadly across the economy, why don't we locate industry in places where we know there's going to be more energy generated in the future? Strategic planning is going to be a great mechanism for doing that. And the two other things that NESO is going to be producing are spatial energy plans, which, as planners, that's a great word. We've not had that before. They've never thought in that sense. So the strategic spatial energy plans, there's a methodology was produced this year. They will be produced in draft next year, adopted, I believe, 2027. That will tell us spatially what types of energy are going to be generated. So in its zones, 17 zones, I think, across the country. In this zone, there's going to be mostly solar and batteries. In this, it's going to be wind. In this, it's going to be hydrogen. And that will provide an evidence base, GIS bases and so on for local authorities, for the strategic authorities to use in plan making. And then beyond that, the RESPs, the regional spatial energy plans, which say in each of those areas how much of that technology will be created and when. Another evidence base for plan making. Unfortunately, probably a year or so behind.
Yes.
So, but they are producing transitional RESP. So potentially an incredible resource for the plan making community to understand what are we going to get so that they can design policies. We know we're going to get loads of solar, so let's engage with that process and try and ensure that the infrastructure that NESO will be building to enable that is going in places that is suitable, that is going to be supporting housing, new data centres, or what have you.
Is it the case we're waiting for a lot of different things to fall into place so the jigsaw sort of fits together? I mean, we've got the NESO strategic energy plans, we've got the regional energy plans, we've got mooted strategic development strategies, which I wrote about, we've got local plans. In order for all of this to work, all of these things need to be sort of coherently fitting together in some way. I mean, obviously they never will completely, and they're all at different stages of development. This is quite a long-term thing, isn't it, surely? And yet the government wants quick results.
Well, it is and it isn't. So, the short-term things, the planners themselves, the planning authorities really need to be engaging with the process. So feeding in their plans. We need to deliver this many houses. They've all got to be electrically powered, including transportation. So suddenly their electricity pie is huge. We want to be putting them here and here and spatially where we want to put them. Therefore, we're going to need this amount of power. They can be proactively feeding into these processes rather than reactively waiting. And that, I think, is something that can happen really, really quickly. But I would say we need to look beyond energy as well. So if we I refer to general purpose technologies earlier on, these are all technologies that are going to affect spatially where things go and how our places look and feel. So the strategic authorities, local authorities need to be giving very careful thought right now to what these technologies are and how they're likely to affect their area, how they're likely to affect how they build houses, the types of houses, the location, charging infrastructure, what types of other infrastructure do they need to create their own evidence bases, which A, feed into what NESO is doing and B, feed back as well. So there are feedback loops that start today, which come together with potentially fewer surprises once NESO has finally prepared its plans, which, let's face it, will probably end up being a bit delayed.
So you've kind of talked a lot about evidence bases and how important are strategic plans in kind of selling the idea of large-scale energy developments to communities, because we've spoken about judicial reviews. A lot of them are community groups kind of railing against new development in their area.
So I would say that certainly can be helpful. If working with NESO, a location is better able to understand what types of technologies NESO is going to be encouraging. So just jumping back to the grid, in order to get your grid connection, you've got to be strategically aligned. You've got to be in a place where there is a need. So NESO has an ability to say there's a need for, let's say, solar in this particular area. So the local authority can then hopefully work more closely with NESO to ensure that infrastructure is going into locations that are most able to accommodate. NESO themselves are doing a sieve mapping exercise to ensure that these are not going to be in locations where you're overly constrained by your standard set of constraints. If local authorities can work through that process and direct these technologies to landscapes and locations that are better able to accommodate them, there is probably more that helps their ability to sell the why we're doing this here rather than why you're plonking this huge development over here. But ultimately, we've got to accept that renewables are space hungry. They are going to transform our landscapes, and they're in locations where often there hasn't been much development. They are rural areas. Now our rural area is going to start playing a very different role over the coming decades. So we're not going to get away from conflict entirely, but these can certainly help us to.
No, absolutely. And I think it's really important to kind of frame that inevitable conflict as, part of a wider vision, a kind of strategic level vision.
I think that's absolutely right. Why are we doing this?
Just leading on from conflicts and the spatial development strategies, about how when we've got our spatial development strategies in place, when we've brought back the strategic planning authorities, it might take the heat out of it a bit from a local level, because the decisions on location, where things have gone, the overall broad mapping picture is actually taken away from the individual LPA, so they can focus more on delivery, which might mean that actually it's a more constructive and more focused conversation than when they're engaging with the locality, because the decision as to area has actually already been made, and that does tend to be the most controversial element of it.
But to come back to that point about the transformation, Rob, we're talking about a sort of wide-scale, large-scale transformation of the way we use energy, the way we generate energy, the way we distribute energy, the way we use the land that provides that energy, the things that appear on that land, the co-location of different kinds of technology. So, we've talked about data centers. One of the waste products of data centers is heat. Where does that come in? How does this all fit in? I mean, we're selling a completely different picture of Britain in a way. How do we do that? And how do these things all fit together? And how are they going to work? And is this going to happen? And how is it future-proofed? This is an enormous question. I'm sorry.
About to say, there's a small question.
Yeah. The future-proofing is a really critical area here, because we're talking about a legacy system that we generally agreed isn't quite fit for purpose in the modern world. Are we just going to build something that in 50 years' time is going to be redundant again?
We've always built systems that will ultimately become redundant. This isn't the first set of general purpose technologies. Our towns, cities and landscapes are totally the product of the internal combustion engine, cheap individual mobility and mechanized industrial farming. That's why our places look like they do today. Go back First World War, our places and landscapes look totally different because they were driven by steam engines and things like that. So to think that we shouldn't do this because it'll be redundant one day is to miss the point. We have to do this, A, because of climate change, but B, because that's one of the factors that drives economic growth. So it doesn't make that selling point any easier, because there's very few people alive today who knew it any other way. But you talk to great-grandparents and they remember a very different landscape. So things change. How does it all fit together? I mean, let's just pick that one point that you picked around data centers, because they're not all hyperscale data centers. There's lots of 10, 20, 30 megawatt edge data centers and so on. But the big ones might be using 200, 300 megawatts worth of power, which A, has implications if you don't carefully think about it, about whether you can build all that housing that you need nearby. But also a lot of that, 95% of that power that's coming in is waste heat at the end. And to do that, you also need an awful lot of water to cool it. So coming back to spatial planning and how you sort of square those circles, we need to be thinking about data center developers, and we work with several to think through these things. What do we do beyond the red line? What happens to this energy when it comes out the cooling pipe at the end? Does that go into a heat network? Could it be used in some other end user in the form of heat? And if we're using that heat, we don't need the water or anything like as much water, because that's there for cooling. So we solve several problems in one, and that if we're piping heat to a new housing scheme, they're going to need less energy in order to run themselves as well. So there's ways that we can think across boundaries. So part of that we can leave to sensible developers, but that ultimately spatial planning must play a role in all of this. So the new SDSs and so on can't come soon enough as far as I'm concerned, and local authorities really need to be embracing this and thinking about it carefully.
It seems to me that actually what we're having are two revolutions at the same time, because you've all been talking about the top down, the large scale energy, the large scale solar farms, data centres, the large-scale heat generation. But exactly at the same time as all of that is happening, you've got more and more people, myself included, and from the conversation we had before this podcast, also Simon with his van and you with your house, each of us have individual micro-generation projects happening on our own homes, in our own houses. My own personal one is purely about bill reduction. So we've got battery storage, we've got solar on the roof, which we're looking to get some more panels in, looking to increase our own personal battery storage, largely because we went electric for the car. So we're trying to basically just reduce our own personal energy consumption off the grid as much as possible. That is happening all around the country at the same time. So yes, we've got top-down, major, significant landscape level shifts happening, whilst at the same time more and more people are individually and autonomously adopting the same technology. And I think maybe that there's an element there where actually we can try and get the message of how these two fit together. So it isn't just top down, it's also bottom up. It's also that you're already adopting this on the small scale. You've seen the benefits for your own individual house, your own individual car, and how this works for you and increases self-sufficiency. So it doesn't really matter if the grid connection goes out, if you've got several hours worth in the battery that can tide you over. Is there a way that we can join up that messaging so actually it seems a lot less scary for people? Because it's familiar on a domestic level, and actually it's just playing out on the national level at the same time, but probably a lot more slowly.
I think this point about selling into the grid is a really big selling point for this. So my father's house, which we've recently sold, had a feed-in tariff. So he was generating electricity. He wasn't using it himself. He was selling it into the grid. I've read about, I have an electric vehicle with a home charger, and I've read about a system whereby potentially that could be a smart charger which moves electricity in and out of the grid. So it sells it back into the grid at a profit to you. So it'll store it in your van or your car or whatever. You keep it attached. When the grid needs it, it'll go back into the grid and they'll pay you for that more than you paid to get it from the grid in the first place because you're using peak time, peak hours.
I haven't spoken to my other half about whether we're feeding in or not. I do not know. But I do know that our charger is set up so that it alternates between our battery storage and the grid depending on where we have the most energy. So it will always take from the batteries or directly from the solar first, which, as I say, we weren't looking to make money for a feed-in tariff. We were just trying to be self-sufficient.
So in a sense, there's a potential for us all to become our own mini electricity companies.
Yeah.
Isn't there?
Yeah.
In a way. I'm wondering here, we're talking about microgeneration, about microgrid networks, district heating networks, that sort of thing. What role would that have to play in the grid and the electricity supply of the future? Does everything have to be national?
No, and it shouldn't be. Everything you're saying is absolutely right. I do sell my power back in between 4 and 7. I make 30 pence every unit I sell back in. It's great. But the bigger point here is that there are going to be those locations that, by virtue of timing, just haven't got the grid that they need. I cite an example of Otterpool down in Folkestone. It's a large consented urban extension, and they've contracted a company to come in and deliver the energy services, the heat, the power, the transportation, electric vehicle charging, that through microsystems, batteries, a small solar farm that we're working on next door, heat pumps and EV chargers. They manage that system in a way that has meant they haven't had to pay to upgrade the grid. So effectively, they use those systems to reduce the demand. So it's effectively what you are doing on your individual homes writ large across a place. So we can work at different scales that ultimately work from the bottom up alongside the top down. Best one in the world, we need all of these things. We can't say, well, we'll do that instead of that. Just doesn't work. No. But we do need them all.
So it's a big part of this, not simply a transformation of the grid as a network and as a kind of piece of infrastructure, but also about its smart, more intelligent management.
Which is where the AI comes in. Put aside the data center as infrastructure, AI is the mechanism for managing the second by second peaks and troughs in supply and demand, and it's a way of managing that from house scale, like I do, up to the entire system scale.
So coming back to a point you made earlier about a sort of wholesale transformation and certain technologies being so utterly transformational that they change the way we live. Are you saying there's kind of a coalescence of different things happening right now, which are all working not deliberately or in a systematic way, but which will have this outcome?
They're integrated and they're pervasive across society. Therefore, they are transformational. And I think the challenge, therefore, for plan makers and planners is to understand what are the priorities for my particular area. So that's where we work as a business. We will get planning consent for these technologies, but we will help authorities and bodies to understand what their challenges are and their priorities in a given new development or a given spatial plan.
So what policies are aiding this transition? And, is there anything that you're not seeing at the moment that you would like to see in a policy context?
This, I would say, is ultimately it's a market and technology driven transformation that is then guided by, I'd say, largely policies that are happening at the national level. This is the push at beyond planning policy, the push by government for net zero by electricity by 2030, by then the solar roadmap, by the wind roadmap, by there are other plans that have come out since the new government was formed, which set targets for assumptions of how much of different technologies we want to see. Formed then by the MPPF. The MPPF will tell us that these things are supported, and it's said that largely unchanged for a very long time. But, it's still there and it's still important. So that suite of planning and non-planning policies at national level is guiding the rollout of these otherwise market-driven technologies. I say market because we're not really driven by subsidies anymore. They don't really exist, and certainly not in the sense that they did. At local level, then, you have local planning policies for renewables, but in my experience, not many of them say much that would suggest that you differ from what the MPPF will say. So it feels like policy-wise, more of a national story. That will change if with spatial planning, because then it becomes more as much about allocations and locations and integrations. Integration, I think, will be a key word in the future. How does energy integrate with housing development, with economic development, job creation, and so on?
In a very unscientific way, I think I've noticed in the planners' coverage of appeals that the grey belt sort of designation has started to play a role in more energy storage systems, more solar farms being approved at appeal. Is that something you've noticed, you've picked up on?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's now there's a growing handful or two of appeal decisions around renewables where grey belt has played a very prominent role. We've got 2 applications at the moment that are live that we would consider grey belt. So yes, those sort of things are playing an important role. I think pre-grey belt, we would have generally advised that the green belt isn't a definitive constraint on a solar farm or a battery scheme. Clearly, it's location dependent.
Very special circumstances in your hand as a result of the energy needs and the transitional needs and the climate crisis, etc. So
exactly, yeah, and that's played through into grey belt as well.
Final question for me before we move on: what do planners themselves need to know about all of this? Is there anything particular planners need to be aware of, they need to be taking on board now in order to sort of become part of this journey and to help it happen?
So I suppose the starting point is to make sure that they do understand, not in any great detail, but just understand that, step back and look at what is it we're trying to achieve here, and how does this particular planning application sit within the transition. So that helps with the sort of messaging to their members and to communities when they're calling up saying, what's all this about? But I think beyond that, then when it comes to spatial planning and strategic planning, they really do need to understand what it is that NESO is proposing and critically to engage in that process. I was talking earlier about the importance of them not waiting for NESO to go, ta-da, here's our strategic energy plan, here's our regional energy plan, but to actually feed in their plans, their proposals, and their needs into that process so that when it arrives, it's already delivering a lot of what they're asking for. So understanding what NESO are proposing, how it helps them is going to be critical. and including, but beyond energy, really just understanding in a given area, whether that's for master planning, whether that's for strategic planning, local plan making, just what are the priorities for you, for them in their particular area. That's a challenging exercise when you've been bombarded by these myriad of changes. Yeah, quick plug. That's where we come in.
Rob, thank you very much. That's been really, really informative and very interesting. Stick around. We're going to talk about something else now, and we've got a nice flow into the next topic, because we're talking about storytelling, really, the narrative, the way you frame something so that people can understand it and buy into it. Nicola, you're our resident storyteller at the Planner.
Is that what our columns are?
Well, but you make them up, don't you? It's on complete fiction. So, yeah, we invited you in today to talk a little bit about storytelling, and, well, go for it.
So, firstly, I am a massive, massive reader and consumer of all types of literature and media. I think one of the reasons Simon got me writing for this is because he started following the blog, which I've calmed it down a bit now. I'm getting older because my pop culture references are aging with me. But I do draw on many, many things, including Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel, comic books.
I see a trend here.
Yeah, I am very nerdy. It is well known. But also Coleridge literature, Terry Pratchett, Mean Girls, all of these different types of stories, connections between things. And I love stories. And I think stories are integral to people. They are part of what make us social beings. I've got family in the Pacific Islands, in Kiribati, used to be the Gilbert Ellice Islands, where a lot of the storytelling is done through dance. But all of these types of traditions, we have historically always used narrative and story to transform. Do not ask me to dance in the podcast.
I dare to ask you to dance your next column for it. And we'll put it out on video.
Don't tempt me.
YouTube channel.
I might sing it as well. But it's an inherent part of who we are as people and how we understand information. It is through the concept of stories and through the concept of narratives. And I think it's fascinating to see how that plays out in the planning system.
Right.
And you can very easily see it in the planning system because the facts of a development do not change. A 49 megawatt solar farm is a 49 megawatt solar farm. The location is the location. The power, it is what it is. The facts of it, the technical specifications of it don't necessarily change. But you can watch in real time get overlaid on that very traditional narratives of heroes and villains and greed and motivations and benefits. All sorts of different ways in which the same set of facts get turned into, take for example your standard housing development on the edge of the scheme. It can be a 100-unit scheme for housing. And depending on who you speak to and how it's presented, it is either greedy fat cat developers who don't care about the community concreting over the countryside without providing national area infrastructure, or it's the provision of homes in the middle of a housing crisis, helping alleviate pressure on the local housing list, helping new young families onto the housing ladder, providing funds for new nurseries and schools and investment into an area. It's exactly the same scheme. The scheme and project itself doesn't change. And I know, Simon, you're really passionate about this, but I think there's a missed opportunity, particularly for public sector planners, but for planning generally, in taking a firmer grasp in shaping those narratives. Because if you don't, everyone else is writing the story around you.
Yep.
And you, as the people who have actually designed this project, you lose your voice.
I think the point there is that there is always a public narrative, or there are always multiple public narratives. And the one that cuts through, there's one that will typically cut through more than others. And it's worth thinking about why that is typically. What emotions are being invoked, called up, drawn upon, manipulated? What feelings, what stories are being told to persuade people to go one way or the other on a particular topic? And of course, what's very evident at the moment, and we're seeing this all around the world, is the primary emotion that's being drawn upon is fear. How do you counteract fear? And I think we're all agreed that, we all broadly agree with the principle of planning, and we all broadly agree that the world can't remain a static place, that the environments we live in have to adapt and change to the technologies that come and influence us, to changes in population levels, to changes in sort of economic working habits and practices, to changes in industry. So we live in a constant state of flux, but there's always this tension between movement and spaces. And people will, in my opinion, typically, they'll prefer to remain with an inadequate or a barely adequate status quo than risk a change to something that might be a little bit worse. So the challenge for us as storytellers is to provide reassurance, to provide a firm, positive, persuasive narrative that pushes people past that fear. And the question is, how do we do that?
Absolutely. I mean, without wanting to give too much away, because in the next issue of the magazine, which we're working on at the moment, Watford Council have taken a really sort of novel approach to engagement with one of their projects, and it's sort of drawing on new technology. But I think at its heart, it's kind of, it's reaching people on their level. It's not 100-page long consultation document. It's accessible, and there's lovely elements of sort of co-design, which is really important. I think kind of touches on what you were saying, Nicola.
I think, there are various places where you start to see this happening as well. And I think East Suffolk do it, because I've heard various people there talk about it. But making it more obvious what the benefits and connections between the development and improvements in the area actually are can help too, because you often get a lot of discussion about how the infrastructure isn't there yet, how there aren't places in the schools, etc. Whereas SIL funding, for example, seeing exactly where that's going, seeing it actually get spent, and being a bit more obvious about where that's come from and how that's played in can also help as well. But the delivery on that is quite important.
I mean, there's a development at the moment, I can't remember where the local authority has been pretty robust, because, the houses have been built, but I think that the open space, or some play areas haven't. And they said, just stop everything. You're not going any further until this stuff's delivered.
And councils need to be tough on that stuff. They do.
But they also need to manage expectations.
Yes.
Because, take, for example, a school. There is absolutely no point having a brand new school there on day one before there are any children to go to it. It's poor planning.
Rob, what's the story for you, for the work that you do? What's the story you tell people?
So I think it's a challenging one. It really is, because, and I think it becomes particularly difficult where development is happening at pace.
Yes.
Stick with solar now, we get involved in residential and all sorts of things which can span many years, sometimes even longer, to come to fruition. So, arguably you've got more time to tell the story than a solar farm, which is, in an ideal world, this is through planning and being built in 18 months.
Yeah.
None of that is to say we shouldn't be telling those stories. And the point you were making, Nicola, very eloquently was, if you don't tell a story, somebody else will fill that vacuum with whatever they want.
Yeah.
And that is problematic. And those developers, those applicants who get it, are going to have an easier ride. I've had experience of a community initially very hostile, but with a developer who really got the importance of this, worked with them, and there were very significant benefits that they managed to work together to develop for that community, which led to them supporting it. And I suspect the Knife Edge Planning Committee would have gone the other way had they not. So, there are very real benefits to doing this. It's just persuading those developers that it's in their interest to do so.
Somebody else we've featured on a planner presentation at a conference before, Rachel Brisley from Ipsos Mori, who did some really interesting work with communities on climate change and climate change adaptation, in which they used what they refer to as deliberative discussion processes to bring a community to a level of understanding, perhaps is the right word, I'm not sure, of the reality of an issue, moving away from, the inherited stuff that they've been hearing around them that infiltrates their minds and influences their views, towards something that is clearer, stripped of that kind of bias, and is looking at it plainly and factually. And guess what? 100 people, the majority of whom are climate skeptical, by the end of it, were saying, we need to create a climate manifesto. And Miriam, in our last podcast from Demos, talked about a similar kind of process where you work with communities intensively over time to give them good quality information, and people then begin to create their own narratives.
So I think that's, demonstrably a good way of doing things. That sort of thing has been trialed in political decision making as well, and I'm a big fan of it. We need to understand the realities of that in the short delivery timeframes. How do we apply that? How many developers, firstly, are going to invest in that ongoing process? Some will, not many. Could we force them to? Possibly. But actually, have we got an opportunity through the move back to spatial planning? And if we're thinking about where things go, then maybe that deliberative planning process and everything that goes with it, that's the place to apply that.
I think we also need to bear in mind the cultural context in which we are doing what we are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So Simon and I had a LinkedIn conversation with many other people the other day about planning and development related stories in the media. And I ended up putting a comment on there saying that you will get double points for anything on this list where the developer is not evil. And I think we need to be aware that the cultural context of stories and myths in this country that people have around planning are about bureaucracy, vested interests, and the big bad coming in and changing the local environment. And those narratives are very common because they're very popular, because they speak to emotions and fear of change, and because they've been going on for decades. It is a human need for every story to have a hero and a villain. And reality obviously isn't that black and white, but when we are putting these narratives together, when we are discussing what we're doing, I think it's very easy to fall into tropes. And you'll see these tropes crop up. For example, if you've got a residence group or something, then there is somebody who is classified as the villain of the piece that is you are fighting against. And it's that hero versus villain, very popular mythic narrative that is being played out. And I think it's really important that when we are telling our stories, we're avoiding the easy option of demonizing X or Y. Because the point is that actually everyone involved is working to their vision of a better, brighter future, because that's what planning is about. That's what we're all doing. And I think it's inherent on all of us to work together when we're doing our storytelling, to do it in a way that paints that bright, positive vision of the future that everyone can bring into, particularly for the planning, because we're a small profession. And the last thing that we want to be doing is pulling against each other, when actually what we need to be doing is selling the benefits of what we do more widely to society as a whole. Because I think everyone's job will become easier if we are stopping engaging with communities with an assumption that someone in the process somewhere has a nefarious motive, and you're just trying to find out who it is.
We need to return to a kind of idealistic, visionary idea of planning and change.
Yeah.
I don't know how we do that. Well, I have my thoughts. Sounds like another podcast.
Well, I think all that remains to say is thank you to Rob, and thank you to Nicola. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you to co-host Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, Ben.
Thank you.
We'll be back, no doubt. Thanks for listening. Bye now.